Bienvenidos, el Cafecito del Día, brought to you by the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement. Our conversations are inspired by the moments of togetherness that nuestra comunidad shares over un cafecito.
Bienvenidos, soy Carmen Rodriguez. Today, we're discussing immigration, labor, and the stories we tell about migrant workers. For more than a century, migrants have been portrayed as threats, accused of bringing crimes, disease, e inestabilidad. Yet, these narratives persist despite generations of contributions by immigrant workers. To help us understand its history y su impacto hoy, we're joined by Eliadio Bobadilla, author of the book Dangerous Migration. But before we start our conversation, we want to express our special thanks to the Labor Radio Podcast Network for inviting us to be part of this important conversation. Acompáñenos. Gracias, Eliadio, por estar con nosotros. Thank you for sharing all the information in your book, Dangerous Migration.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be talking to you.
I would like to start our conversation with the sentence that struck me. Migration is an existential threat, because this is a rhetoric that is not new at all for us. 100 years ago, migrants, especialmente inmigrantes mexicanos, were described as dangerous, disease, even evil. Today, we're hearing ese mismo lenguaje, the same narrative. Why do you think these narratives survive generation after generation, even after migrants have contributed so much economically, culturally, and socially to this country?
So it's difficult to really pin down what happens when things sort of stay the same. So historians are very good at finding reasons for change and for why things develop the way they do, why we see swings back and forth. But it's often harder to make sense of something like immigration's staying power as a kind of tool to divide people, to create narratives. And it really is. It has tremendous staying power. This fear and panic about immigrants has been fairly consistent. And I think partly it's because having a large group of people without full political rights in the country provides a perfect scapegoat. There's always an element of illegality, of people living outside the law, and they are living outside the law. Now, that's a policy choice. We can change that. But it's useful for the right, especially, to have a group of people, a large group of people who are here in the country without documents. You can make them scapegoats. You can talk about them instead of talking about why people don't have housing or health care, or why people are struggling to pay the bills. You can always blame any struggle on immigrants, especially those who are illegal. I hate the word, but it does describe people outside the law, and it's useful, again, for that reason, because it marks them as deficient in some way, as being outside of society, outside of the law. So I think that is primarily the reason why this is staying power. It's a very useful topic. When people want to talk about why things are expensive, why inflation is bad, why education is getting out of control, why gas is almost $5 down the street. If you're a politician, if you're someone who has to respond to those concerns, it becomes easier to just blame someone else, to blame immigrants. And that's what I think we have seen for decades, and really for a couple of centuries. It's a really useful population to restrictionists and generally, of course, to reactionaries who are not really in a position to talk about the real challenges that Americans face today. So it's easy to just say, it's immigrants, they're the cause, they're the problem. Let's focus on this one issue. Let's focus on this threat. And that's always been the case.
In Dangerous Migration, you explain how migrants were portrayed as bringing sickness, moral decline, and social instability. We heard similar rhetoric during the pandemic, during the presidential debates, and we're seeing and hearing and watching that on social media. From your perspective, what purpose does this fear-based narrative serve politically? ¿Y por qué es tan efectiva that narrative?
It's a long playbook, or it's a very old playbook. This has worked before. It's been attached to a number of different people, not just Latino immigrants, although, of course, that's kind of where we are today. But these same narratives were often applied to people we now consider white. Benjamin Franklin was terrified of the Germans because they weren't white enough. They weren't American enough. They couldn't become American. And then the country sort of pivots away from that fear, and it becomes the Irish who are the threat because they're Catholic, because they're different. They sound different. They act different. They have different backgrounds. different religion, then it's the Chinese and so on. And it just continues through the late 19th century and into the 20th century when it really becomes Mexican and Latino immigrants generally, but for most of this history, Mexican immigrants who become this threat. Again, I think the reason why it has so much staying power is proximity. So the Irish assimilated over time, the Germans, of course, too. The Chinese, not so much, but they were easier to keep away. Whereas when we share a border with a poor country, it's really difficult to close off the flow of migration. And so that's just been a recurring presence and also been used as a recurring threat. As to why it's so effective, we live in a country that has been defined by myths, and one of those myths is that we're a nation of immigrants. But to create that myth, which sort of seems like a positive outlook on immigrants, you have to create a counter narrative, which is there are bad immigrants. There are people who do it the right way, and there are people who do it the wrong way. And historically, Mexican immigrants have been seen as essential, but also very undesirable. And since the 1960s, we can talk more about the specifics of that law if you want, but since then, it has been effectively impossible for most people from Latin America who want to come to this country to do it the right way. But there's still a ton of demand for them and for their labor. We love cheap labor in this country. We love what immigrants provide us. We just don't like to see them and to experience them as full citizens. So I think why it's so effective is it's proximity. Part of it is Mexico is right there. So there's this fear that an invasion can happen anytime, that an invasion is already underway, that invasion has already taken place. And for most of the 20th century, that language was being used. And somehow we've survived so many apparent invasions. What I think most Americans want to think about, want their government to concern itself with, is providing them some basic human rights. People want to be able to make a living with some decent, dignified work. They want to be able to pay their bills and pay for healthcare and send their kids to school. And when those things get difficult, all that reactionaries have to do is, again, say, you don't have these things because immigrants are taking them from you, because they're too expensive, because they're the ones that are causing problems, because there's too much crime, and so on. So it's effective because people respond to fear. And immigrants are a very vulnerable population, but also one that can be depicted as a threat on a dime, anytime, in any context.
There is one surprising part, and it's when you discuss about the farm workers movement and how there was a consistent tactical stance against undocumented workers, even within the labor organizer spaces. Can you explain us a little more why that posture existed and at that time? And do you think it still impacts unity within the labor movement today, especialmente entre los trabajadores latinos? Porque también you mentioned about a division among Latinos and Mexican communities.
The reason I wrote this book, the reason I got into this research question was because I grew up in Central California, the home of the farm workers movement, and everything there harken back to the 1960s, to Cesar Chavez, the farm labor struggle. My parents were farm workers. Most of my neighbors and people that I knew were farm workers, or had been, or had some relation to farm work. And yet I didn't know anybody who was a member of the farm workers union, not a single person. So I wondered why. And when I got into the archives, one thing that I realized that I didn't know, again, having grown up in the Valley, I had no idea, was that the UFW, and Cesar Chavez specifically, was extremely anti-immigrant. I mean, they would turn over immigrants to the Border Patrol. They would call in raids. They even created their own little Border Patrol. It was totally ineffective. It was kind of a joke, but it was ideologically meaningful. And it was also violent. So although they weren't very effective, when they did come across immigrants, they often beat them. There were serious allegations against these farm worker organizers who sort of became quasi-border agents. And there was a logic to this. I mean, and in fairness to the union and in fairness to the moment, there was a logic to it, and it was a real problem. So the farm workers movement, after the Bracero program is killed off, they see an opening. They see a moment where they can actually work for better wages, to be able to collectively organize and bargain. They see a moment where they can improve their conditions. We got to remember that most of these workers didn't have access to clean water. They didn't have access to breaks, to regular breaks. They were working in 110-degree heat with very few protections, with no access to bathrooms, just horrendous conditions for very little pay. But what employers do often is they just hire undocumented workers, right? If there is a drive to organize a particular region or a particular company or set of workers, then employers just say, fine, we'll just bring in illegals and let them work. And so the union did face a real problem here, and they had to deal with it in some way. What troubled a lot of people was how they went about it. So Chavez never meaningfully attempted to organize these undocumented workers to welcome them into the union, sometimes even to inform them of the work that was happening, because when workers, undocumented workers, were informed, they often did leave the fields. They understood that they would become scabs and refuse to. That's the most surprising part. When you look at what's happening in the 1960s and 70s, to me, it's more surprising that there was pushback. Because until that point, this was how labor treated the undocumented. This is how they saw immigration. They saw it as a problem, as a fundamental and major problem that prevented them from organizing effectively. And that doesn't actually change officially until much later. So it's only around the year 2000 that the AFL-CIO really pivots. What was surprising at the time was that there was so much pushback. And I think that's because a lot of Mexican Americans had begun to rethink their relationship to immigrants and their place in the U.S. It was a very difficult moment for the union, but it was also an ugly moment where they responded in ways that were divisive and sometimes violent, and that really troubled a lot of Mexican American activists and other labor organizers who had started to think of the problem in different ways.
There is also a powerful line that I found in your book que llamó mucho mi atención. And it's in the 60s, those who opposed immigration were too liberals, while today those who oppose immigration are too conservatives. How can you explain this political shift? ¿Y qué nos revela esto about how immigration debates are often shaped?
So I started in the 1950s with a group of Mexican American organizers who are adamantly anti-immigrant, or at least anti-immigration, anti-illegal immigration. I mean, they frame it in different ways, but their concern is how immigration is affecting Mexican American communities. So they're very much opposed to migration, and they want something done. They want deportations. They want a tighter border. And then if you look at the conclusion, then I end with this group of Latinos who are pro-MAGA, pro-Trump, and who have become apparently more so. Like, you would think that after the first Trump administration and the horrors we saw, family separation, zero tolerance, all of those extremely troublesome and disturbing images and stories, that Latinos would become, that they would pivot away from Trump. And that's not what we saw. We actually saw that on the whole, they became more pro-Trump and more anti-immigrant. So one of the things I wanted to make very clear in this book is that, while we start with this group in the 1950s of Mexican Americans, Latinos who were opposed to immigration, and we end with like Latinos for Trump, I want to be clear about a couple of things. One is that that's still a relatively minority opinion, although it's shockingly high. The Latinos for Trump group, the anti-immigrant, like explicitly anti-immigrant Latinos, it's hovering anywhere between 30s and 40s in percentage of people who have those views. So a majority still are relatively pro-immigrant, and it's complicated. Like what that means can be really complicated. Being pro or anti-immigrant doesn't actually tell you much about the intricacies of Latino identity. But if we just look at how do Latinos feel about undocumented migration, there's a sizable group who oppose it, who are very concerned about it. And there was a group in the 1940s and 50s who also opposed it. So yeah, but still a minority. But the second point is that if we look at just those people, those groups who are Latino and oppose undocumented immigrants or immigration, or who have nativist attitudes, what we could call restrictionist or nativist attitudes, they're not the same people. Like they're not the same. It's not the same mentality in the 50s that it is now. So in the 1950s and through some of the 60s, it's liberals. It's liberal Mexican Americans who, again, are pro-labor. And so they see the influx of immigrants as a threat to unionization and to to collective bargaining and to getting contracts, to really making strides at work. They see that problem, and so they feel that they have to curb it. They have to stop the flow of migration so that they can build these movements and these labor organizations. Today, or more recently, if we have Latinos who are anti-immigrant, and there's lots of them, we do certainly have big groups of them. They're not liberal. They're not opposing migration because they want to organize at work or because they see migration as a potential problem in creating progressive movements. It's quite the opposite. It's because they've become so conservative that anti-immigration is part of the package, and they see themselves often as being the ones who did it the right way, or people who descended from people who did it the right way. They see themselves as American, and what that means is complicated, and it varies from person to person. For some people, it really is a kind of aspiration to whiteness, where they feel like they can become white by opposing immigration, or they can be accepted as white. There are white nationalists who are Hispanic, which can be bizarre. There's Enrique Tarrio from the Proud Boys. There's Nick Fuentes, who's I think a Mexican father. So there are those who genuinely see themselves as white, and so they feel like they have to oppose immigration because they're white and these immigrants are not. There are others who see themselves as American, and that's their identity. That's what matters to them. It's not so much that they think of themselves in racial terms, but they think of themselves in national terms. And so this is where I think you get a lot of ICE agents with Hispanic last names, and folks who maybe don't necessarily think too much about race. They see a good job with good pay, good benefits. That's what's available. They take on these jobs. It becomes part of their identity. And then there are other Latinos who have complicated feelings about immigration, who feel some compassion, but feel that it should be done, again, quote unquote, the right way. Often those folks don't understand that there is no right way.
This is so important because, as you have explained us, there's this sense, even among Latinos, that, oh, why you're not doing it the right way, or why you haven't done anything to fix your status. So, and as you mentioned, this comes from misinformation, of the same use of the narratives. But how could we, from the labor movement, take a better approach and try to explain or implement a different narrative in which we can say, oh, look, this is not just easy, as you say, let's fix your status. This is a process, and sometimes, as you mentioned, can take 100 years. Sometimes it can take a little less than 100 years, but it's hard. So how could we approach to that?
The labor movement has a real important role to play, and we've seen it already. So again, when we look at the history of the labor movement, by and large, what you see is restrictionist tendencies, which makes sense. Labor historically has sought working class unity, but that becomes difficult when you have outsiders making that organizing more difficult. So historically, labor unions have sought rights for American workers. And again, there's a logic to it. If Americans have certain rights, then it becomes easier to organize labor in those terms. In certain industries, though, that just has never been feasible and hasn't been the reality. So farm labor is one of them, the service industry more recently, because those are the people doing the work by and large. It's not always immigrants, and it's certainly not always undocumented immigrants, but they make up a huge proportion of very critical industries in the U.S., from construction to the service industry. And so if labor is going to be effective, if it's going to organize workers, it's those workers that they have to organize. And so we've seen a shift take place. It starts, I think, in the 1960s when you have the farmer labor movement, and again, this backlash against the Chavez and UFW-led anti-immigrant push. But it takes some work to build, and it takes figures and organizers thinking about the problem differently and creatively. And so you have people like Bert Corona who look at what's happening with the farm labor movement, and they say, yeah, sure, like it makes sense that you would be angry that there are so many immigrants coming in, that they're undocumented, are being used as strike breakers. But if we go after them, then we're not really doing labor organizing. That's not what it is. These are the workers doing this work. And if we all unite, if we all find ways to work together, to fight together, then we all come out on top. So for someone like Bert Corona, the game was rigged. And if we played by the rules of the game, we were going to lose. And by we, I mean both immigrants and American workers, especially Mexican American workers. But if we changed the rules of the game, if we defied those rules, and if we imagined that there could be a different way of thinking about the problem, then that could be a way out. And for a lot of unions, that was the moment they had to rethink how they approach this problem.
Gracias, Eliadio, for this conversation, and thank you for making the time to sit with us.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thank you for your questions.
As we heard today, immigration is not just an immigration issue, it is a labor issue. Too often, workers are told that immigrants should simply fix their status without understanding how broken and limited our immigration system really is. That's why the labor movement must continue to support a comprehensive immigration reform that protects workers, working families, and communities. We encourage our union siblings to learn more about these issues and to help implement the AFL-CIO's 2026 Solidarity Convention resolutions, which reaffirm that unions must defend workers' rights against detention, deportation, and exploitation. Share this episode within your network. Start a conversation in your local union and keep building solidarity across workers y para los trabajadores. Because when we protect immigrant workers, we strengthen the labor movement para todos. Nos escuchamos en el próximo Cafecito del Día.
El Cafecito del Día is part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network